their safety in having a nuclear device. And there are many that believe that the only reason that the U.S. have not taken direct action against North Korea or Iran is because the fact that they have a nuclear device at their disposal. The other comment that I would appreciate if you can address is the fact that many consider Israel to be a much greater threat to the stability of this region than Iran. Yet U.S. policy endorses the fact that, that Israel might actually have a nuclear capability, and we're okay with that. However, Iran or any other countries, it's considered to be a much greater threat. Thank you.
Two good questions. On the first question, I would say that among the reasons why the U.S. attack on Saddam was, I think, a dumb mistake, was that it helped reinforce the impression that if you don't have nuclear weapons, you might come under attack by the Americans, and that if you did have nuclear weapons, that might protect you from that. That was certainly one of the lessons the North Koreans attended to. But it cannot be the case that the U.S. has not attacked Iran because Iran has nuclear weapons, because Iran doesn't have nuclear weapons. So in Iran's pursuit of nuclear weapons, it's put itself in a danger zone from potential attack by Israel or by the U.S., but it hasn't yet reached its nuclear weapons goal line. It'll be a different question, and your question would have more bite if Iran actually had a nuclear arsenal and it conducted a nuclear weapons test. So it certainly is not the case that for whatever the reasons why the U.S. has not attacked Iran, it's not because of Iran having a nuclear bomb, because they don't have a nuclear bomb. The Israel issue is a much more complicated one and would take a long lecture, but let me try this to be brief. Is there something strange about the fact that most of the time when this topic is discussed, in the U.S. especially, Israel is sort of left out of the conversation? The answer is yes, that's strange. Israel's posture of having nuclear weapons but not discussing them publicly has actually been a good thing in terms of not exciting the politics in the region greatly. And I remember talking to an Egyptian friend about this at one stage, saying that it was quite helpful in terms of Egyptian politics, because if it was a well-discussed fact that Israel had a nuclear arsenal, this would be a greater motivator for nuclear weapons aspirations in Egypt. And I take it that that's the correct calculation, though I'm not an expert on Egyptian politics. I think the Israeli arsenal, which was built up now decades ago, they regard as their kind of ultimate security blanket. And given the history of the Jews in Europe, they have this understandable trauma that's part of their insecurity, their inherent insecurity. For myself, and I advise this for Israelis in general, I do not think that their nuclear weapons program makes them more secure. I think it makes them less secure. I think that it makes their environment more dangerous, because I think it provides an incentive for other states to get nuclear weapons. I think Israel has an inherent security problem given the policies that it follows, but I don't think that those problems are advanced by its having a nuclear arsenal. And one of the interesting outcomes of the last Non-Proliferation Treaty Review Conference was a commitment to have a discussion of a weapons of mass destruction free zone in the Middle East before the 2012. So this conversation will actually be held sometime in the period ahead. And it's a very complicated one, because Israel worries about chemical or biological weapons in other arsenals, for example, the Syrians or even the Egyptians, But I think it's the right conversation to have.
Let me just follow up on the, not quite a follow up. Of all the states that have sought nuclear capabilities in recent years, some have been sort of economically underdeveloped, like Pakistan. Others have been more repressive regime, like Iran, and some both, have a bit of both, like North Korea. It occurs to me that in the long run, the only viable global solution to nuclear proliferation and related danger would be perhaps sustainable economic and political development. So if I were to put that in another way, won't legal and institutional non-proliferation arrangement fail in the end unless we really address this tough problem at the same time?
Mm-hmm. That's a very good question. I think it's complicated, just as you suggest. If in the security studies, in general, when the question is why do states seek nuclear weapons, first and most powerful motivation appears to be security concerns. So especially if you look back at the World War II, when nuclear weapons were developed, the US thought the Germans were developing nuclear weapons, which they were. Germans were worried about the Americans, particularly the Einstein crowd that had come over here after they were, after they left Germany, developing nuclear weapons, so there was a race there. So now the Americans got there first. So now then the Americans used nuclear weapons against Japan, so now nuclear weapons are a fact. So the Soviets were terrified because here's the Americans and there's a deadly contest between these two powers. So the Soviets pursue, full West. Once the Soviets do a test, Mao says to his colleagues, whatever it takes, because China's worried about Russia. So you've usually seen these dyads in which the security dimension of it was the most powerful motivator. The most interesting case, if we're just doing case studies, and relevant to your question, is the South African case. There was only one state in the world that made nuclear weapons all by itself and then dismantled them and eliminated their nuclear weapons all by itself. And that's South Africa. So in the 1980s, South Africa built up an arsenal of 6 nuclear weapons. And then before the handover, at the end of the apartheid regime, they dismantled all the nuclear weapons. So there's a lesson that reminds us, this is not a one-way street, that people can go both ways, but how one would play in the development dimension and the rule of law components, given that in the US or Britain or France, you've got long-established democracies and developed countries and rule of law and also nuclear weapons. And then in some other states, like North Korea, you have none of the above, but you also have nuclear weapons. So it's a mixed bag in that dimension. Yeah.
Wouldn't you argue, or would you not believe that the threat with, say, Iran or nuclear, with North Korea, state programs acquired and bent on acquiring a nuclear weapon along with the delivery system that they have is fundamentally different than nuclear terrorism, where a terrorist is trying to acquire physical material from a secure program like Pakistan?
So if I understand the question, it's kind of how to compare the threat of the states and the terrorists?
Yeah, your presentation view
Right.
just laid up all those slides, but it didn't really evaluate.
I was
terrorism.
mainly focusing on the terrorists and the states as a potential source of the weapons, but I think your question is a very good one to remind us. So how could things go badly if the global nuclear order turns out to be as fragile as the Wall Street financial order was? So one way they could go very badly is you would have a nuclear war. Now, if there were a nuclear war between India and Pakistan today, who knows how many people, 30, 40 million people could die very quickly. So this would be not the worst thing that ever happened in history, because 50 million people died in World War II, if you take it all in. But in a short period of time would be the worst thing that ever happened. And psychologically, God knows how can we no, we can't imagine how our minds, would be thinking the week after such a horrific thing. I mean, right now, 30 million people? No, no one can imagine that. Okay. So it would be a horrible, horrible, horrible thing. There was a period in the Cold War, I mean, I'm an old Cold Warrior, so I